Hello and welcome once again to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I'm Clark Coffey, and with me, as always, Cullen McFader. What's up, Cullen?
Hello. Hi. Not much. How are you?
I'm doing all right, man. I'm excited to continue on with documentary filmmaking. We've got Lesson 22 and Lesson 23 that we're covering today, which is a continuation, basically, of last week's two lessons, which is documentary filmmaking, dealing with human beings, and truth in nonfiction. So, yeah, I'm pretty excited, man. But
yeah, I mean, a good way to describe this one, I suppose, is just that it's kind of honing in on that, the interactions and the rapport that you can have with somebody, especially.
Absolutely.
Importantly for us when things aren't necessarily maybe the most amicable of situations to be interviewing someone.
What was that word again, though?
Amicable.
I do that all the time.
I kind of
it's okay.
Blurted out there for a second.
It's okay. Hey,
yeah, just wait till we get our whiskey episode.
I know. Wait till we get the whiskey episode. I tell you, like my wife is always like making fun of me because I will mix words up, or I will, I'll make up my own pronunciations at some point. I mean, hey, it's all
fun. It's
good.
It's Clark Coffey right. English.
We're taking some poetic license here, so audience, just remember that if you ever hear an interesting pronunciation of any word, we know, but we're just taking our poetic license with it. And, we're going to talk about the truth not being in the facts. So we're just extending this to words and syntax and, it's right. It's we're taking our poetic license here. But anyway, well, I'm glad you're doing well. You said it was hailing up there. That's
yeah, for a little bit it was, yeah.
It's about, we do our little, we've got our weather thing going on. I think it's probably in the low 60s here, quite a bit of haze. I can't quite see out to Catalina Island. It's a little hazy, but otherwise quite nice. We've got COVID is running rampant out here, which is sad. So this is nice to have something to do here as I'm stuck in my home. So I'm thoroughly excited to jump right into this. So I guess let's do so. So Herzog starts right off the bat in Lesson 22, talking about respecting ethical boundaries. And I think that's a great place to start because it kind of, that's going to impact everything else you do, right? When you're making a documentary film where you're interacting with other live human beings with emotions and desires and a life. And, but he immediately points out that there aren't any clear rules, that you have to find these ethical boundaries or borders for yourself. And it's a tough one, and I think that's obviously there are some major guidelines that are pretty simple, but oftentimes I think you'll find yourself, if you interview enough people, if you're stepping into the life of enough people, you're going to find that there are a lot of little gray areas that might be challenging. And I don't know if that's...
You can't just rely on common sense. Yeah.
It's really interesting, but you can't. I mean, sometimes you really do have to give it a lot of thought. And, just as an example, kind of, a little one of the documentary films that I'm in the middle of working on, it seems like I'm always in the middle of working on one, but I promise I will wrap some of these. But, one of the documentaries...
That's okay. We all have those.
We all have those. Yeah. I mean, hey, even you and I have one that we've been working on now for a year and a half. So, but, it's sometimes a question of, how far do you step into somebody's life? How do you do so without being exploitive? And, I've seen examples where I really felt uncomfortable and I couldn't even quite put my finger on why, but there was something about an interview. There was something about the way a filmmaker was handling a subject and it wasn't clear, right? It wasn't like they were clearly insulting or belittling or trying to show in some kind of negative light, but there was some kind of this difficult and sometimes challenging to define exploitive thing I felt like was going on. And you and I were
I think what's also really key to point out too is that exploitation doesn't have to be intentional. It can be accidental. You can be interviewing somebody and just not even realize that through, whether it's a point of privilege or something like that. Absolutely. But you can you can truly accidentally exploit
you can,
subjects and
so that's
people,
and that's what makes this such a compelling issue, I think, and sometimes a challenging one, is that it's not always obvious. I think a lot of times we think that it is, but it's not. It is not always obvious. And like you said, and that's a really great point, sometimes it's on accident and you don't realize it. So, I think it's, we all have to, and Herzog's right. I mean, I don't even know how to get much more specific into it. We do have to find our own way through that. We do have to find and define our own boundaries. Experience is probably a good teacher, and I think you've got to be willing, like you just said. I think if you find yourself where you've shot some footage and you're sitting in your editing bay, and either you or one of your fellow filmmakers or even somebody else that you're showing the footage to, if it starts to get the sense that it doesn't feel right, you probably have to be willing, I think, to abandon that and try a new tact. But it's a continual learning process. It's something that I've definitely found I refine. I mean, obviously, like just as human beings, not as just filmmakers, but hopefully you're constantly refining and improving upon your own ethical, like internal guidebook, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is something I always say in regards to narrative film, and it's usually regarding, effects choices or specific, whether it's a cinematography choice. But I usually say, if your effect is going to be distracting for the audience, no matter what the intention is and what the desired outcome is, it's probably just better to scrap it. And I think the same kind of applies here, where it's if you are interviewing somebody and they give you juicy details and it's like a fantastic interview, but it so still tempting. Feels exploitative.
Yeah.
The audience is just going to be distracted by that, and you're not going to get the desired reaction of sympathy or empathy or whatever from the audience that you want, because they're just going to be thinking about like, geez, this director really
was not aware,
really just exploited for lack of a better term, exploited this.
And maybe, it's difficult to land on, because I would never pretend to be, an ethics expert. Only in my own life have I spent time, trying to work towards a framework that I feel like is a good one. So I'm not somebody who's studied this forever. But I mean, one of the tools that I found are very helpful is to elicit the opinion of others, especially if your subject happens to be someone that comes from a completely different place than you, whether that's gender or race or religion or anything like that, to actually, elicit the feedback of someone from that group that you're interviewing and get their thoughts on it. Somebody who has a closer perspective or life experience than you do to the subject, that can often be helpful, I think.
No, exactly. I mean, you use, pull out all the stops and use whatever you can to, and I especially when you're dealing with documentary, which is real people, real situations.
Yeah.
Just make sure you triple check and, dot the I's and cross the T's and stuff like that. Make sure that you are, justifying the use of anything, because that's, again, that's kind of, the same goes for a narrative that deal with true stories and things like that, or if it's like a biopic or based on a factual event. The worst thing you can do is misrepresent, or again, we keep coming back to that word exploitive, or you don't want to wind up with that, because again, no matter how good the movie is, in the end, people are just going to remember it for that.
And there's a great example actually in this lesson that Herzog shares of his film Grizzly Man. And there's a couple points here that I think are really interesting to make with this example. So for those of you who might not have seen it, there is a scene there whether you have, I'll just point to the scene no matter what, so you know what I'm talking about. But there's a scene in the film where Herzog is sitting across the table from this woman he's interviewing, and she has an audio recording of, and I'm gonna forget. Who was what Grizzly Man's name was? What do you remember?
Timothy Treadwell.
Okay, Treadwell's unfortunate death, killing by this bear. That's hopefully I'm not spoilers there for the documentary Grizzly Man. Sadly, this man was killed by a bear, and this is an audio recording of his unfortunate killing. And, Herzog...
He and his girlfriends.
Right. And that's correct. Yeah. Right. Not just him. And so here we have an audio recording of two people being killed. Now, Herzog talks about...
In a very vicious, brutal way, yeah.
Right. Which, yes. I can hardly think of a more vicious way. It's pretty gruesome even to imagine it, but that's kind of part of this point I'm making. So he's, and he refuses to play the audio, even the audio. So we're not even talking about video, which would obviously be, extremely exploitive, but he's not even willing to play any of the audio. And, he says that he was pushed by his producers. He was pushed by the network that was going to air it because, right, this is sensationalism. This is like juicy, right? They want ratings. They want controversy to an extent. They want publicity. Herzog says, I'm not going there. I'm not doing that. And what we have in the scene instead is this extraordinarily effective filmmaking going on where we see Herzog listening. And it's one of the rare occasions where Herzog is actually in frame during one of his, films. We always hear his narration, right? We always hear his voice, but he is almost never in frame himself. He's actually in frame. You can see he's listening to this, but you can't see his face. What we see instead is the face of this woman, and she's watching his face react to the sound, which she's never listened to, by the way. She's never listened to this. Yeah. And so we see through her face, her reaction to Herzog's face, and it's so powerful.
As he listens, yeah.
And it's such amazing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, she is, I believe, Treadwell's ex-girlfriend.
You know that it could be. She is someone who's certainly close to. Yeah. Maybe you can look that up.
She was his, but I believe she was his ex-girlfriend who remained close to him.
Right. So definitely,
of course, not the girlfriend who died in the tape. But
so close.
But no, it's a powerful moment,
and that's I think the great thing.
What we described it too, which is like it's the same principle as like don't show the shark. Right. And I don't mean to kind of trivialize a real event like that to a point of just like filmmaking techniques, but it winds up being more powerful because
it's more powerful. Just like forget the ethics, right? Which I'm certainly not suggesting you do, but what I'm saying is that I think more often than not, if you push yourself to have a higher ethical standard in your filmmaking, you will actually be pushing yourself to just be flat out period making a better film. So it's not like you're losing something, right? You and I were talking about, some of the. I had an example. You and I were sharing some YouTube videos of this filmmaker who were doing interviews, and some of these subjects, the interviews were like people in some pretty dire situations with poverty or drug addiction or
prostitutes,
homelessness
like
and prostitution, And I was, because I'm always trying to kind of refine this. And I had seen some of this footage, and it's very well done. It's very well shot. But there was something about it that really did not feel right to me. And it made it such that I could not watch, much less appreciate, much less like empathize with the story that was going on there, because something felt so off and so uncomfortable. And it's that hard, again, I felt like these people were being exploited. That was just not... Yeah. And so you don't want to go there because it's just flat out doesn't make good film. I don't want to mention the channel's names. I don't think, again, kind of like we were describing earlier, I don't think it's intentional on their behalf, but I didn't get that sense at
all.
There's
something to describe it. There's something about sitting, one of the ones that I watched was a lady who had been in prostitution for a very long time. And she's sitting in this studio on this stool, and it just feels like a more refined kind of modern art version of like a freak show. Yeah. And like it's like this like we're gonna put somebody in this nice lit studio, put them on a stool, we're gonna ask them some questions, maybe we'll buy them lunch, and then like what and then that's and that and I don't know, I could be wrong. I don't know if they continue to support and talk to these people after. I would doubt it because there are a lot.
But just taking the film as its own, right? Yeah. But just taking the piece of film as its own, and you had the same feeling, right? No,
it was
and so
it was. I mean, it really just made like I don't think I even made it through a full one because it just made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's too uncomfortable.
And that's again, that's like, so I can totally see the person who produced this and directed this, like their vision is like, oh, it's going to be so raw and
and having the best intentions, like I want people to empathize with these subjects. I want people to see these people as full human beings and to not sit in judgment of them. And I mean, I fully believe that is the case. I don't, there's nothing there that I saw that would give me any indication that this was a purposeful exploitation. And I think it's so important to kind of, just reiterate that it's often not intentional, but it doesn't matter.
It goes to show you have to be really careful.
You just have to be so really careful. And I think it's really important to elicit feedback during your filmmaking process. Again, I think especially from, if you're interviewing people who come from a very different place than you, it's helpful to probably get feedback from people whose lives are similar, or in the, I would never, for example, I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I would never pretend to understand what it would, be like to live from a woman's perspective. I would elicit a woman's, feedback if I had some kind of concerns or questions or doubts about, interviewing a woman about things that I just couldn't possibly know. So,
and I mean, Herzog is really interesting in this too, because I think one of the keys is the questions that you ask.
Yeah.
And so the thing about that YouTube channel is that it's very often just asking questions about everything to do with their struggles and everything to do with like, how'd you get here? How blah, 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 blah. Whereas what I find really interesting about Herzog's questions, no matter what the person is that he usually just asks questions about the person themselves.
Yeah.
He doesn't ask them,
right.
into the abyss. He's not sitting there going like, so what do you think got you into prison? What was it like to murder those people?
Right.
Why did you murder them? It's a question about the person's state of being.
Right.
What do you think about? How do you feel? And I remember, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. If not, I might have just mentioned it to you. But there was this time when I was down at this like row of bars just near the house where I live. And there was this one-legged homeless man outside this convenience store.
I remember this conversation.
And I remember seeing him, and I just kind of like thought I bought him a chicken sandwich.
Right.
And then as I was talking to him as he was eating it, I just realized that he had so many stories, and that he was like a really interesting storyteller. Yeah. And so I sort of sat down and talked to him for a bit. And again, it was one of these things where it just immediately sprung in my mind, where it was like, I would love to get this guy on camera. Right. But I don't want to be the person that's just like going up to a homeless person and being like, here's a camera, talk to me.
Yeah.
And so I passed it by him, and he actually got like, he kind of prepped up and got really excited about the idea of being interviewed. And I still haven't done it. If I see him again, I think that I would certainly think about it. But again, it was the entire time in my mind, I was like, I never once asked him, like, how'd you lose your leg? Why are you homeless? Right. The stories that he was telling me were about like when he would go to discos as a kid, and when he would go, and it was like these like happy times.
I think it's when you make,
to me, that's more interesting.
And again, like, and look, I'm never going to pretend like I'm some expert in any of this. And honestly, a lot of this right here in this episode, and heck, this has been the case for all of our episodes up until this point. I mean, I've never putting myself in a place where I know more than somebody else. This is often a way, this podcast is a way for us to explore in real time. We're brainstorming, right, our thoughts on things. But I think, hearing you speak and describing some of these differences you see, talking about the different types of questions you ask, I mean, I think maybe hypothesis is, in some of those YouTube videos that we were talking about where we felt like they were exploitive, it kind of felt like the person was maybe, and likely on accident, coming from a place of like separateness. Like, I'm here and you're there, and your experience is not my experience. And not necessarily that person was judging, like you're less than, but there was like this wall of you're different. You and I are not the same.
And that's kind of why I describe it. It's like, it was like this, again, this modern freak show where it was like,
and let's highlight how you're different, and and there was like a certain amount of kind of like this little sensationalism of like, it's like if you ask someone, well, like, how did you end, there's a way that you can ask somebody something, and it's just like what you want is like this juicy story of like, how did you end up in prostitution, or how did you end up homeless? I don't know. And it's hard to pinpoint, but I feel like maybe some of it is, and Herzog definitely talks about this in this lesson and numerous lessons. And I really feel like it's a narrative through with all of these lessons about documentary filmmaking, is that, you've got to see this person is a full human being, and that you and them are in some way the same. I mean, I think it still just comes down to empathy again, and to see whoever is in front of your camera as a full human being that you are in effect the same as, right? This we are one kind of connectivity. And it's like, if you start to see these subjects as different in a fundamental way, I think you're going to treat them as fundamentally different. And and you're right. Then that becomes like you're putting somebody on a stage and saying like, look at this person,
And that's exactly what I think we both mean by exploitative, is that you are putting this person on display, and you could have the greatest intentions, but at the end of the day, if your intentions are to be like, look what your life could become, or like, look what some people live like, it becomes, again, it's exactly that. And it may be that your intentions are, well, I want to show people what people live like because I want them to empathize, but it's like that, you're kind of having the opposite effect. You're basically just allowing room for condescension. Whereas what you should be doing is exactly what Herzog does, which is to approach these things with a human eye and sort of go like, where do we relate? How do we, how are we the same?
The commonalities of the human condition. And I think, one of the other things too, and again, it's like, it's so difficult to kind of, we all have to work to refine these things for ourselves, but certainly I think, watching interviews, taking a look at different approaches, whether at television and film, and start to kind of see for yourself, but really focusing on how you feel like the filmmaker is treating and interacting and utilizing these subjects as part of their film. What do you feel like their intentions are? Why do you feel like they included those questions, that interview? Was there intention to sensationalize, to titillate, to educate, to empathize? I mean, really conscientiously start to analyze these things in other filmmakers' works, and I think then you can start to refine for yourself what your boundaries are, and then you can consciously apply those when you're in your filmmaking work, as opposed to kind of like letting it happen on accident, and finding yourself in a situation where you're unsure, but you've not spent the time to prepare and think about this issue before. I think, a lot of people will sit down and they'll spend a lot of time thinking about what questions do I want to ask this interviewer, or, you'll spend a lot of time planning a lot of aspects, but how much time was spent beforehand prepping yourself for the more challenging and subtle and nuanced ethical questions that might come up? And I think it's
another thing that Herzog talks about too, which is that he says that he spends an hour with everyone, every person before just talking, and it's like that to me is very important. Is
not pre-interviewing though, by the way, but just
exactly.
Human to human,
not sitting there asking the questions and then going, okay, I'm going to write that down. I like that.
Yeah.
But exactly, just again, building a rapport, especially because people, some people are just camera shy. Some people you're going to be talking to people about things that they don't necessarily want to talk about, or that they have never
very sensitive
about openly.
And
that's it. And Herzog tells the story about the father and the son in Into the Abyss, where it's the father that's kind of recoils and pulls back at the idea of talking about, the fact that he is sitting in prison with his son who is on death row. And there's this, feeling that it's like you could very easily jump into this idea. Well, okay, we're on camera, so I'm gonna push him.
Yeah.
But Herzog doesn't do that. Herzog kind of opens him up very gently, almost, and almost, I don't want to say tricks.
No, it doesn't trick.
But almost like just he lets the guy know that he's not here to exploit him, that he's here to discuss the human elements.
Well, that's another good point. I think people often can understand when they're being exploited. I think people can smell it. And so that's important. This is another angle to really be cognizant and careful of these things, because the openness with which you approach your subject and the intentions with which you approach them, I think, are gonna often be sensed by the subject. And so Herzog does push a little. He does, when the father in prison says, "I can't talk about that," when he's talking to, Herzog asks him to talk about how he feels as a father that his son is on death row. They're both in prison. Well, this is asking somebody potentially to admit, to kind of face some pretty intense shame, I'm going to imagine. And none of us like to do that, I don't think, very much, especially on camera.
Yeah.
So, but I think he always, he's always gentle. It's never a conniving or a manipulation or even like an aggressive push. I would kind of think it's like he invites. It's more of an invitation. And I think there's a big difference, So there is a little bit of resistance from the father, but I think Herzog has earned his trust, and I think with just another invitation, then he eventually does open up. So I think there's a big difference. If you're holding in your mind and heart that you're inviting somebody to do something, that's going to have come out as different behavior than if you're pushing. I think they're very different.
Yeah.
And I think Herzog is a good example. If you watch him in interviews, I think he's really quite good at inviting people as opposed to pushing people, even when he doesn't accept no. And he is kind of, he is eliciting. He's trying to kind of pull some extra depth out of an interview subject. I always kind of feel like it's more of an invitation. And so maybe that's a good way to kind of look at it, But
because I don't think, I especially don't think too, if the father were to say, like, I'm not talking about this, I have no interest in talking about this, it makes me really uncomfortable, I don't think Herzog would continue to prod and prod and prod. I think, I think Herzog would, just like with the priest, I don't know if priest is the right word, because that might just be a specifically Catholic thing, but the guy that does the chaplain or whatever of the
I think it was
death
chaplain.
house.
Yes.
And how he, again, but that's a great example of how Herzog gets around this thing, is the guy clearly isn't really interested at the beginning in opening up, and then Herzog just asks him, okay, what about these squirrels? And tell me about that. And then the guy completely opens up. It's just because I think he knows that, again, someone like Werner Herzog, and it's not just because Werner Herzog is Werner Herzog. It very much is because of the, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these people had no idea who Herzog was.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And so it's not just a matter of like a matter of celebrity or respect because he's got a name for himself. Right. It very much becomes this, and it's actually very interesting because it's very similar to, and again, I think this is another thing that I've mentioned before, but there's this great, and I think I've sent you this, but there's this great YouTube channel that does like interrogation breakdowns. And I might have mentioned this actually in the last episode. But I'll just reiterate it because it's very pertinent. But it's like essentially there's these tactics that you can use in interrogation, and they do some that are very successful interrogations, of people who have just either murdered their families or murdered somebody, and it's like very heavy stuff, but it's really interesting because it kind of teaches you how to talk to people. But there's some really good examples, and some of the best examples are exactly that, where it's this, you talk about something arbitrary and you let the person just basically spin on and on about something arbitrary until they get this idea. They come around. Okay, so now I've been talking a lot, so now I'm just more used to talking, so now I can. Whereas you go to another one, like there's some that are just abysmal interrogations. I don't know how these people have the job of interrogating, where they just go in and they're just drilling the person constantly. So the person
it's
just
like
shuts
that
down.
Stereotypical, like they're holding the light in their eyes and they're like
literally
standing over them.
In some cases, and so you wind up getting this really good look at, like, and of course that's a very specific circumstance, but psychology is quite applicable to different circumstances. And you just see okay, what generally makes somebody open up and what generally makes somebody shut down and kind of close off, and more often than not it's just a comfort level. There are people that within an hour of being in and being asked to come in for questioning and have very little evidence against them will end up confessing. Just simply because of how well the interrogator just spoke to them and just got in, not an aggressive way, like not like them saying, oh, we know you did this.
Probably like a pretty empathetic way, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, very
I
much of
seen
just,
it, but...
yeah, and it very much often it's an approach of, like, listen, like I am here to help you get out of this. I want you
I want to make a caveat here, though. In that I think there's a big difference, though. Like there's a limit to this comparison with the with the interrogators, though, because I think the interrogators are pretty much kind of hiding their intent. Their intent,
and they're very much there to exploit.
Right, it's like there is a big difference, and so although some of their tools may be similar, I think their overall intent and strategy is different than what yours as a filmmaker should be.
Totally,
I think. No,
we
could totally discuss it, and there could be interesting discussion around that. But
and that's exactly what I mean when I say that a lot of like psychology like that is kind of applicable to different situations, because although your intentions may not be in a interviewing situation of an interview on a movie, a doc, to, of course, like get information. You should. I don't think that that's ever an intention that somebody should come in with, is like, I want to get this specific piece of information out of this person.
Right.
Much like a confession. Like, you shouldn't be looking for
you're not
quote-unquote confession.
And we're going to touch base on some of these things, because you're a filmmaker, not a journalist.
Yeah.
So
but some of the ways that you could, again, use those tactics are just, again, in the way of comforting someone. And unlike an interrogator, you can have your comforting be completely genuine, but you can still use the same techniques to get there.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's really interesting, though. I think that, it's an interesting thing to watch and kind of study, just because it's so applicable, of just like talking to people who may be uncomfortable or nervous about talking about certain things, be it because of the subject matter or just be it because of the circumstance.
Right.
Of like sitting down in front of a camera.
And often it's both,
have never
because
done
most people are not comfortable in front of a camera, and most people aren't comfortable talking about sensitive personal things in their life. So so you're likely to find that quite often.
And I know we did discuss similar stuff in the previous episode, so I want to kind of actually touch on just some stuff that we didn't, just to kind of change up the I guess the pace a little bit. Which is actually kind of coming into lesson 23 a bit.
Okay. Yes. Truth in nonfiction.
About the truth. Yeah, exactly. About truth in nonfiction, which is all about, and pretty good segue, because you just mentioned the thing about the journalism,
right?
About, like, not wanting to. We're not here to be journalists.
This is definitely an interesting topic.
Storytellers,
because I think this has gotten confused big time.
Yeah, and it's you've got a pretty pertinent point here, which is just like, documentaries don't just have to be facts, because facts don't make truth.
Facts don't make truth. Maybe we can say this like 5 or 6 more times. I feel like this is so important, and it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I think with the proliferation of the short form, I don't even know what to call them. They're not videos, with the proliferation of YouTube and I don't want to get into a political discussion or anything like this, but I do think it's important to discuss the difference between documentary film, journalism, didactic videos, and propaganda videos.
Yes. Yeah.
Those things are different, all different things. And I think that we, both filmmakers and audiences, get confused as to what documentary...
They can be hazy, because the differences can be sometimes blurred.
They can, but I think that there are some ways that we can effectively distinguish, and I think that you can use these distinctions as a filmmaker to help guide you, at the very least, to be aware of what you're doing. If you think you're a documentary filmmaker but you're making propaganda, these are two different things. You should be aware of it. And I think I've seen so much work where it's just, there's clearly the filmmaker themselves are confused. And I think let's start with some of the easiest. As Herzog specifically talks about the difference between journalism and documentary, and we, and maybe it is a little, blurrier than, maybe it's not perfectly clean cut, but in my mind, it kind of feels like it. I think journalism should be about facts. And it should be obvious when you're giving an opinion versus expressing just, these are the facts of what happened. As a documentary filmmaker, you aren't bound by any of that. You are completely free to to make your film as if it were a fictional narrative film, in my opinion. And I think, I mean, and one of the things that I love about Herzog and his documentary films is that he allows himself the freedom to manipulate, to make up. He gives examples in this lesson about quotes that he just pulls out of thin air. He makes them up himself, and then he attributes to historical people. He manufactures all kinds of situations. He scripts things. He coaches his subjects. He completely manufactures things in his documentaries. And because,
I mean, that's kind of what the base, like that is pure filmmaking, is the manipulation of space and time. So the idea that, that's what I think people have to draw a super, super clear distinction between those two things, because you cannot go into making a documentary by saying, well, I'm going to get some facts, I'm going to read some like peer review essays, and that's going to be my move. And I think that, to relate it to the project that we're working on right now, we very, very quickly, when we were jumping on this idea of making a documentary about like different lines of thinking, conspiracy theories, things like that, we very clearly were like, we don't really care about the content of the conspiracy theories.
Right.
Like, we're not going to be going in for an analysis of what QAnon believes. We are interested in what the people that believe them are like, what brought them to those beliefs, why did they...
What does this say about the human condition?
And again, very much what we were talking about earlier, which is like, how do we relate to them?
Right.
In what ways are we very similar and stuff like that?
Yeah.
So
it's
that kind of is very, very distinct difference to me, is just this idea, like, what are the motives? Are you going in to, educate people on a topic, or are you going in to enlighten people on an experience that they may not have ever had or even thought about before? I mean, language that I would use to kind of describe the difference is, I mean, I love this idea, this simple sentence: facts don't make truth. And I think most people get that pretty quickly. You can have a laundry list of facts, but what does that speak to? What does that point to? And I think, when Herzog uses the word truth, he's talking about a fundamental kind of absolute human... Yeah, I was going to say human
aesthetic
truth, kind of,
moment of awe is trying to find like words to
almost like a truth of nature, if that makes any sense.
A truth of human nature, the truth of a shared human condition experience, something that is inside us that speaks to a commonality of experience in all people, right? This is, I think every painter, every poet, every sculptor, this is what you're shooting for, at least ideally, I think, when and this is some differences, right? If you're working with something didactically, what you're trying to do is educate. You're trying to inform, and that's different.
Especially because it involves point of view. It should always involve your point of view. And
for documentary, for journalism,
and that's what I mean.
It's
is that it's but that's what I mean, is that it's like, you're always to pretend that there's no bias in a documentary.
It's ludicrous. It should have bias, and it should have bias.
Yeah, exactly. It should be very much you should feel the person behind the documentary or the message or the intention.
Right.
Whereas if I'm reading a article on, election results, I don't want that. I don't care about
unless it's specifically labeled, this is an editorial, this is an opinion piece,
opinion column,
and that's different. That's different. There are places for obviously there are places,
but there are also reasons why those are clearly labeled.
Exactly, and that's where
like that's.
But people do get confused. I mean, I really do. I have a lot of friends. I know a lot of people. In my life where they're like, they send me a video and they're like, look at this documentary. It's not a documentary. It's a piece of propaganda.
Yeah.
It's,
oh my God, especially with COVID.
And all kinds of stuff. And again, we don't want to get into a political space here, because there's propaganda on all sides of the political spectrum. And so the point is not to speak to any of it specifically, but it's just, there's propaganda, which is trying to manipulate somebody into thinking a certain way. Like in the most generic kind of layperson definition, didactic is I'm trying to instruct you in how to do something. And clearly those two things can kind of be together in one piece potentially. A piece of journalism is, here are some facts. again, ideally. And then a documentary is, this is a personal expression of opinion with an attempting to speak to a underlying fundamental shared experience of the human condition by ideally utilizing aesthetic awe to do that, to open up a heart and mind. There's my best. That's my best.
Well, I mean, look at something like Triumph of the Will.
Yeah.
Leni Riefenstahl, which is by all means an incredibly effective piece of propaganda. But, technically speaking, Riefenstahl, in the circumstance that she was working in, it's not like it makes it less of a movie because of its subject matter, if that makes any sense. Whereas if it were to be, if that were to be something like a newsreel trying to be, a piece of journalism, then that would completely change the context. But the fact that its intention is to manipulate,
well, that's propaganda,
and its intention is to propagandize, right, exactly, makes it, that still makes it successful in its goal in a weird way. And it makes it really, an interesting thing to study, because you kind of sit there going, you can't fault the movie for being a piece of propaganda when it was trying to be a piece of propaganda in the first place. And I think that's exactly where you've got to, again, draw these distinctions where it's like, if you were to take that exact same context and the exact same message behind that movie and, again, put it into an article or put it into something that's meant to be, this journalistic truth of facts and stuff like that, then it wouldn't work at all. Just on a purely, artistic scale, it wouldn't work. Because it's now you're losing all these elements that would make something journalism. Whereas when you put it back into the context of it being a movie, a propaganda movie, it suddenly works perfectly for its intention.
Well, but I just want to be, I want to be clear here, or at least I will speak for myself and not you, but I want to be clear. I mean, saying that a piece of propaganda is an effective piece of propaganda is not saying that it's like ethical, acceptable.
Oh,
that
no, it's not an endorsement
is in any way, shape, fashion, or form being endorsed. I just, I want to say that for myself for sure.
No, of course.
Regardless of what, I'm not a fan of propaganda, regardless of what the message is, whether I agree with it or not. Because I don't think manipulating people in that way, because it's almost always a manipulation that is not accurate
but that's exactly what I mean. Is that I of course detest the situation around everything in that movie and that entire era.
I was like waiting for you to get there. I just would, I think I knew what you were saying, but I just wanted to give you a chance to really kind of clarify that.
I think the point perhaps that I was trying to make is more that you strip away the context of that, and you look at the intentions of what it's trying to be as a propaganda film, and again that. Essentially, it is successful at doing what it is trying to do, in that it is trying to propagandize.
Help me tie that into our argument, into our little discussion.
I just mean that if you're making something, you have to know what your intentions are in making it, and you have to know what you are trying to make.
Well, I think you should be aware of it. I guess, my perspective, exactly. What I'm trying to say is this. I'm trying to say that because hopefully we're speaking to people who want to be documentary filmmakers or like film or like Herzog. Hopefully their intention is not to go make propaganda or to make didactic work, right? That's my hope. Now, if you want to be a journalist, then go listen to another podcast, because I'm sure there are a lot of them that are about how to be a great journalist. So hopefully we're speaking to people who are interested in documentary film or want to be a documentary filmmaker. What I'm trying to say is you need to be aware of the distinctions between propaganda and didactic work and journalism, so that when you set out to make a documentary film, you're coming at it from the angle of making a documentary film. You want to steer yourself away from tactics that would be used in propaganda. You want to
and the reason I brought up that was because I have heard a lot of people refer to Triumph of the Will as a documentary, as a piece of,
I got you. I got you. I see what you're saying. Okay.
So I think it's like if you haven't seen
you're saying it's clearly a piece of propaganda.
Yeah,
all
it's
of
a very
it points
clear
to
cut,
it was effective
the intentions behind
historically,
it being
right?
made.
Its intentions and its effect and everything about it is propaganda. It is not a documentary film. It wasn't, but I see what you're saying. But you've heard people refer to it as a documentary film, so they're mislabeling it and misunderstanding it. Gotcha. Yeah, and that's what I think.
But I mean, but that's what I mean is interesting about all of this is that it's again, just like you said, there are very clear distinctions, and that's where sometimes people can try to blur it. There are a lot of
or they're just unaware
documentaries. Again, if we talk about YouTube, where it's like you how many documentaries come out on YouTube that
are not documentaries at all.
That are, and I'm doing air quotes. Of course, nobody can see me doing air quotes, but you look at these like very, very conspiratorial, and they can be really, really good at just almost trying to do the journalism thing too, where they just present facts or they cherry pick facts out of a study or something like that, and then it's like, well, what do you think this means? Draw your own conclusions. But they're not telling you to draw your own conclusions because they've drawn all the conclusions for you.
And they're not documentary films. So that's
and they're not
and
exactly.
They're always going to exist. People are always going to make them. Yeah. But ideally, we're speaking to people who want to be documentary filmmakers or filmmakers. Period. And it's looking at these other, I'm just going to call them media. They're like just completely other mediums, in my opinion. Even though they use moving pictures, I don't even see them as the same thing.
It's like calling a newspaper a novel.
Yeah, they're just completely different. Yeah. And just because there's paper and ink, it's not the same thing. And I see it as so fundamentally different, and the goals are so fundamentally different. And again, I feel like as a documentary filmmaker, your goal is to illuminate fundamental truths of the human condition aesthetically, and it's not about telling somebody what to think or how to think it. It's not about showing someone how to do something. It's not manipulating people into a belief system or out of a belief system. That's not what documentary filmmaking is. So that's.
But and with that being said too, it's important again to have a grasp on what your point of view is.
Well, you must,
because a lot of it's about perspective and about and I think that a lot of people get that confused as well, which is like, well, if I'm sharing my perspective in this movie, how is it not me?
And that's where they're getting confused. They're confusing journalism
exactly.
and documentary filmmaking. And that's why I think it's important to really fully understand that distinction. Right. Because if you're likely not going to be a very good journalist if you think you're a filmmaker, but you don't think that your opinion should be in it. And you're also not going to make a good film if that's the way you're seeing it. So, you're confused, and you're not going to do either of those two things a service. So, and again, I please, if anybody out there wants to make propaganda, I hope that you don't. Please reconsider that. If you are consciously making propaganda, I implore you, please stop and think about what you're doing and don't do it. And
I think another I think perhaps a key distinction between propaganda journalism and documentary is that documentary, when we say that the truth, like facts aren't truth, what we don't mean is like this alternative fact kind of thing where it's like you're making up lies.
Correct.
Propaganda relies on lies.
Absolutely.
It relies on falsities.
Absolutely.
Journalism relies on facts. Documentaries, I don't even want to say the documentary is somewhere in the middle, because it's not.
It's a different thing.
Nothing to do with propaganda.
Totally
but documentaries is about taking those facts and applying perspective to them.
A document,
exactly.
It's like one thing is a poem. Journalism is a newspaper. And again, and those other things I think are manipulations, and they're not even in the same.
Some people might not even know that they're doing So I will say one really easy way to find out is if you're making a documentary and there's something, and you are intentionally leaving out facts, or you are intentionally, mischaracterizing something, or you're just flat out putting something in there that to be untrue. You're not making a documentary anymore. You're now making propaganda.
Well, this is interesting though. Let's see this though. But so there's a way I could interpret what you just said though as kind of contradicting what we've said, right? That it's not about facts. Documentary is not about facts. Documentary is about like a deeper personal experience, or, so it's like, I would actually say, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but I would say you're absolutely free to leave out any quote unquote fact that you may stumble upon as you're interviewing someone, or as you're, doing your documentary. I could film a landscape in Missouri and tell you it's Antarctica if I want to.
Oh, of course. I mean, but I think that it's about,
so what do you,
to me, when I say that, it's more about so if I'm interviewing somebody and they say, let's say that I'm doing an interview, let's say Into the Abyss, and I'm interviewing somebody and they unequivocally deny their charge. And they say, I didn't do this, I didn't XXX, I didn't kill, my wife or whatever. Yep. And then at one point they say, let's say I did kill my wife, and you cut around it. Yeah. And you just get the part that says, I kill my wife, and you put that in there again.
Example.
And that's a very clear example. And it's like a very obvious
But it's interesting. Example. Let's examine this for just a second. So like I said, audience, this is like a real-time, brainstorm. This is a real-time examination. So, who knows? We may contradict ourselves within, one episode, much less previous or
just
future.
Just like Herzog.
So, but let's think about this. I mean, because you've got kind of like a confabulation of several different things here, I think, in this one example. So what you're talking about is you are cherry picking from an interview what you're going to put into a documentary. And the example you use is that you have a person who's in prison, and they say a whole bunch of times, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I didn't do this. But then one time you have them like kind of imagining hypothetically if they did. And so you take the language of that hypothetical example and you make it seem like they're admitting that they did this when throughout 90% of the interview they said they didn't. Well, I think, so going back to the first part of this podcast, everything is situationally specific. I think it's, you have an ethical question here, first and foremost, which is it appropriate to misrepresent your subject and radically change what they said? And I think the answer to that for me is that is not ethical. And so it wouldn't pass that test for me. Now, if we move on to the second part of our conversation, which is like, okay, the difference between documentary filmmaking, journalism, propaganda, etc., it's really difficult for me to say because, documentary, again, is not about the factual representation of things just in their pure factual form. But you likely would be going against as a documentary filmmaker, you probably are still even transgressing there, because the idea is not to misrepresent, like that's just a very interesting question.
I think to me and I think that an interesting aspect to look at is a lot of Netflix documentaries that have come out, a lot of their crime ones especially.
Right, all this true crime stuff, it's everywhere,
There's to me, it's not necessarily like I of course, point of view, and again, there's this inherent bias, and as we said, you should have a bias. So if you're choosing elements to include into your
you always
cut of your interview,
you always are
that support your point. Then of course, my point more is that if you are,
but I don't consider those documentary
intentionally
films.
But I mean, if you are intentionally misrepresenting something that someone said to the point that it is the antithesis of what they were saying, then you're no longer bending the truth to your perspective. You are now faking it. And to me, fakery of that, and I don't mean just fakery as in like getting a stock footage shot of.
We have to be we have to be very specific with our language.
When I say faking it, I don't mean Herzog, getting someone to do something again and pretend that it is their first time saying it. That's fine.
Well, what about
when I say faking it? I mean faking it as in you are lying essentially. You may not be lying with words, but to the audience you are now explicitly lying to them.
Let's explore it though. How is that lie different than Herzog's lie, where he writes a quote and says this is from Pascal, and he puts it in the film, and it says Pascal, but he wrote it. Yeah. And it's not; those are two lies. But how are they different?
Again, I think it's the context.
How are they different?
I think it's Herzog's use of that is not to mischaracterize Pascal in a way that supports his point of view to a degree that would be, propagandistic.
Okay.
Whereas me going out or as another example, me getting a quote from a politician and taking that out of a huge sentence, which is something that people do.
Sure.
It's to me, to go back to the newspaper analogy, it's like looking at tabloids versus, headlines. Headlines over recent times have started to skew very much in the direction of tabloids. And I consider tabloids to be a form of propaganda, because they are very much about sensationalism.
Yeah.
They're very rarely true at all.
Right.
They're very rarely even based on any truth at all. They're about making things up and selling them for sensationalism and for, if anything, the extremification of people's beliefs and sowing division so that they can make more profit off of that division.
Right.
So to me, it becomes that difference between, a personal point of view of me in a documentary getting a quote from somebody and, perhaps shifting that quote into a degree that would make that appear that they were agreeing with me more than they were.
Well, I
versus
imagine motive.
Somebody disagreeing with me and then me twisting that into them agreeing with me, if that makes sense.
I think motive is important, right? So let's look at it from that perspective. Let's take some of these examples we've just been talking about. So Herzog's motive for making up a quote and then attributing it to Pascal, and I can speak a little bit to this because Herzog literally speaks to this. Like he actually, so I'm not putting words, although I'm paraphrasing him, I'm not putting words in his mouth. He did that because he was his motive, his goal was to illuminate this, what he saw as a deeper truth in his film. And so his goal was that that was his motive. It wasn't to bring harm to Pascal's image. It wasn't to to hurt anybody. It wasn't because he had some particular or specific political agenda or anything else. It was he was utilizing it as a type of poetry, okay, to elicit a deeper gravity and emotional response in his film. Now, so I think motive is really important here, and that's why these lessons are so connected, right? Because you can see how your ethics is involved in all of these decisions, and they can get very complicated and nuanced and difficult fast, which we're illustrating here over the past 10-15 minutes in this podcast. But let's say, so there's lie A, and your motive is to illuminate and to elicit an emotional response. And then your example where you are mischaracterizing the total overall intent of an interview's words. And in your case, it would be to do so in a very negative way because you're making it look like somebody has admitted guilt versus professing innocence. So you've so materially changed it, and it's clearly in a way that could be detrimental to that person. And, I don't know what motive could exist that would overweigh that result. So,
and I think too, there's no, these are very clear cut examples, and that's why they're examples, because they're made up. There's no, and I think you would agree with me that there's no, and that's kind of why at the beginning I said that there's no hard stops. There are ways to distinguish these three things: journalism, propaganda, and documentary. But oftentimes people can use the fact that there is blurry lines to their advantage. And that's how they can get away with presenting a documentary film, presenting propaganda as a documentary film, or presenting propaganda as journalism. Because you can really take advantage of, you don't know. Let's say that the person in that example that professed their innocence is black, and I am somebody who has deep racial undertones to all of my work. That's not, of course I'm not.
Right.
Just for
I understand.
Just for clarification, in case someone takes any of this out of context. But which is exactly what we're talking
motive
about right now,
is a
but
racially.
Let's say that the director there is racially charged. It's a motive to stir up hatred towards a certain race. Yeah. That then again, that's where it leans into propaganda, and that's where you then go back and you look at things like Triumph of the Will, things like Soviet propaganda, things like fascist propaganda from Italy, And it becomes so, like, you kind of look at it and you go, okay, these things are very clear because of the style that they're made and the
well,
kind
and
of
the
the
historical
aesthetic of
context
their
has made
movies.
them
Yeah.
clear. We consume a lot of propaganda today that is
that,
just as clearly made, but is less considered propaganda because we don't have
because of the
distance of history.
onslaught of media.
Right.
So I think that's where it becomes like, so what, to me, despite the fact that might be in a completely documentary, again doing air quotes, setting and a documentary context, that to me instantly turns it to propaganda, because now you are no longer looking at this idea of, let's again go back to this facts don't make truth. You're still looking for truth. I'm not looking for personal truth. I'm looking for truth about human nature. I'm looking for things that are fundamentally true, that I may believe to be true to the purest extent of my being, things that I believe are true. As soon as you get into this line of things that aren't true, but you are presenting them as truth, that's when it becomes propaganda to me.
Well, don't forget though. I mean,
and again, it can be blurred. It can be very, very hazy.
Just to play devil's advocate, but of course, people could believe with all their heart and soul in something that something is true when it in fact is not. And so this is where again, it's so,
it gets back to motive.
But even people can feel like they have. Right, a positive motive, and of course it not be. But look, the point is not that we're never going to be able to present this in this perfectly defined way for an audience. I think the point is more, as we discuss these things, that it's great to discuss because it helps refine your own boundaries and your own guidelines for yourself. It also helps you as an audience to understand what type of content you're seeing, as a filmmaker.
To keep an eye out for those things.
As a filmmaker, to hopefully move toward or move away from propaganda and move toward a motive of an illumination, utilizing aesthetic awe. And for me, truth is a very challenging word, and I think we've illustrated that it is for everybody actually. And and we can say absolute truth, you can say big truth, you can use capital T truth, but none of these things actually define it really any further. We're never going to be able to fully define it. For me, it's about an aesthetic truth, some kind of, and I can't say it any differently. It's not about some kind of literal truth, like there's a grass in my front yard, and yes, there is, but that is not a truth. That's a fact.
But then it becomes, and then you could make a documentary. But the truth, I could ask you, why is the grass?
But if I go outside,
but
my point is that if I go outside and I stand in it, and I feel it on my bare feet, and I close my eyes or I lay down in it, and I am moved deeply by the experience of being with it. That's the truth that I'm looking for as a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah.
So I don't know another way to describe it, and everybody will have their own. But the point is not that you accept ours, or even that you have one and only definition for yourself, and it stays that way forever. It's a constantly evolving, I'm constantly redefining mine and trying to better understand my relationship to it. And I mean, hell, it's something that I, in kind of a meta sense, it's what I'm exploring with my film. What is truth? What is your truth? What is the truth? What is, none of us have a monopoly on it. And Cullen and I don't know any more about it than you do, likely. But we're just here talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's all conjecture. And that's why, but I think that's exactly why it's important to kind of understand that and to have that kind of those glasses on when you consume anything.
It's important to be thinking.
It's analyzing, and
you're never going to come to and it's like you could interpret, the way Herzog presents it here. I would be so interested if you asked 10 different people, 100 different people, what their, understanding was of what he was talking about at the end of these two lessons that we've covered today. I think you're going to get 100 different answers. Everybody is.
You also probably will find people who find Into the Abyss exploitative,
and you know what,
or Grizzly Man,
absolutely.
And it's like that's exactly,
and you could even make Grizzly Bear. I think you could, or Grizzly Man. Sorry, you could I think there's quite a few people probably you could find that would consider some of that exploitive. So look, audience, every person in an audience is going to see things through their own, we all see things through our own kind of prism and lens of our own experience, and all of our experiences are a little bit different. So, and that's this is like one of the extraordinary challenges and the extraordinary gifts of art and filmmaking, is that none of these things are cut and dry, and you could live 100 lives and never get tired or bored of, of figuring out how you personally are going to handle all of these different questions.
Yep. No, I think that's...
There we go.
Great place.
So, hey, you know what, guys? That was fun. I mean, sometimes this stuff is not cut and dry. Sometimes this stuff is kind of messy.
That's why it's so important to interrogate these ideas.
It is.
And to kind of go through them.
And I really enjoyed our conversation, Colin. I think it's like, and sometimes it gets a little messy, and like you and I are trying to kind of sort out even our own thoughts as we kind of walk through this, are independently ourselves, and, kind of come together, and it's all kind of this mismatch of...
And just as we wrap up too, I just like, this is what I love about these episodes, is that this is more in depth than I've thought about these lessons and these ideas than I did when I was just watching them, or even just kind of discussing them before.
Well, that's the idea. Exactly. Is that hopefully we're adding a little bit of something to those discussions, hopefully. And again, the idea is to like I've said this probably at the end of, all of our episodes, or at least the past few, is that I love doing these podcasts because it gets me inspired, it gets me thinking, and hopefully that's what they do for you out there listening. It's never to say this is the answer. It's hopefully to say, like, here's some ways to maybe think about it, and maybe, that'll inspire you to think about it on your own a little bit more, and to totally disagree with us, or whatever the case may be. So, all right. Well, let's see, as we wrap up here, I can't believe it, dude. We are almost done. We have almost covered every single lesson in Herzog's Masterclass.
Woohoo! The next few are quite different.
They are quite different. Well, we're going to jump
all about career strategy.
So this is something that we've really, I don't think, touched on, or at least very little so far. So next week, lesson 24, career strategy. I think,
which is great because we're both right in the middle.
We're both right in the middle. So, and then lesson 25 will be life as a filmmaker, and then we are basically done. Totally amazing. So I look forward to that. But Colin, thank you so much, dude, for your willingness to kind of jump in here and kind of wrestle with some of these larger, challenging ideas. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully everybody out there did as well. So until next time.
Yep. See you guys.